There are 4 parts to the test. Part 1. You will hear a tour guide talking to a group of visitors outside an historic country house. For questions 1 to 8, complete the sentences.
So here we are at Newton House, a typical 18th century English country house set in its own beautiful park. Before we go inside, let's look at the park, which really is a classic example of its type, with rolling grassland and scattered trees. Park is a word we use a lot nowadays, but if you trace back the history of the park as an idea, it is actually something which came into being as recently as the 17th century. People in the 15th and 16th centuries wouldn't really have understood what a park was. The idea simply didn't exist. But our ideas about the countryside have changed a lot since then too. People in past centuries knew about agriculture because most of the population was involved in it. But nature, in the sense of wild places, was seen as something dangerous. People wanted civilized, man-made landscapes that showed how the wilderness of nature could be made safe and beautiful. This was how parks began. Well, only rich people had parks, and socially, parkland quickly became significant as a status symbol, first appearing near large country houses like this because it was where the richest people, the big landowners, lived. Also, very symbolic socially was tree planting, because trees involve long-term investment. They express a confidence in the future, and so they were carefully planted in prominent positions. What happened during the 18th century is that the park became even more important as a setting for a large house, and the fruit and vegetable gardens, which had always been attached to houses, became less significant, often hidden away to one side. This was because if the park was to clearly distinguish its owner as a wealthy person, it needed to be beautiful, but not very productive. The immediate surroundings of the house were predominantly grassland, therefore, not fields of crops. They would look too much like work. But that doesn't mean that the land was completely useless. Rich people often involved themselves in breeding animals, for example, which was regarded as a kind of acceptable form of agriculture, something more like a sport. Later in the 19th century, urban parks appeared, taking up some of the ideas of rural park design, and those coming from romantic traditions common at the time of what represented the picturesque. These pretty corners in cities gradually came to be used for the recreation of growing urban populations. This was quite a different purpose from that of the country park, which could be seen as representing a kind of barrier around the rich who were increasingly wanting to distance themselves from local farming communities, as well as from the growing urban areas.
That's the end of Part 1. Part 2. You'll hear the winner of a competition for young inventors talking about her invention. For questions 9 to 16, complete the sentences.
Our guest today is Sonia Reed, winner of a competition for young inventors. Sonia, tell us about your invention.
Thank you. Well, the judges in the competition were looking for a new invention that would be both useful and commercially viable. Although I knew my invention was of use to people, I'd never thought about the commercial possibilities, so winning was a lovely surprise. Briefly, my invention is a medical thermometer for blind people. Basically, it differs from a normal thermometer in that it makes a noise, which I thought would be useful for people who are not able to see. For a temperature of 37 degrees, which is normal, it gives 1 beep, and then 2 beeps for 38 degrees and 3 for 39 degrees. People have been surprised that it only has 3 signals, but actually human temperature varies very little, and so that's really all that's necessary. The aspect that I'm less happy with is the noise itself. It would be better if the thermometer could speak, like some watches can. It could say something like, 40 degrees, see a doctor immediately. But to do that, it would have to be much bigger, and I wanted to keep it about the same size as an ordinary thermometer. It still has various advantages over the conventional thermometer, actually, even for sighted people. Firstly, in hospitals, nurses take people's temperatures but don't always tell them what it is. They just whip it away, which worries people. With one that makes a noise, everyone knows what the situation is. even in the absence of a doctor. And of course, it's good for all sorts of other reasons. It's unbreakable and there is nothing poisonous in it. The idea first came to me actually when I was feeling unwell. I dropped a glass thermometer which smashed, and the mercury inside, which is poisonous of course, splashed all over the floor. I started to think that thermometers really had a lot of disadvantages. That's when I had the idea that maybe an electronic sensor could be used to record the temperature. That's where my colleague Colin came in. He advised me about the best kind of electronic circuit to use. Some people are worried that all this bleeping may disturb patients in hospitals, but we don't think so because it switches itself off after 5 seconds. If it didn't, people might leave it on and the battery would run down very quickly. As it is, the power will last for a very long time indeed, so you don't have to keep on buying a new battery for it. And, as a result of Colin's design, you get what I call an immediate response. You don't have to sit there for ages with it in your mouth waiting for the mercury to react. Now, if there are any questions...
That's the end of Part 2. Part 3. You'll hear part of an interview with a sculptor who is talking about his life and work. For questions 17 to 24, complete the sentences.
My guest today is the artist Allan Carey, who over the last 30 years has established himself as one of this country's leading sculptors, making a range of fascinating objects out of metal, stone and other materials. Allan, welcome.
Hello.
But you don't come from an artistic background, do you, Allan?
Oh, absolutely not. If my father had had anything to do with it, I'd never have gone in for sculpture, because he was an accountant and ideally he wanted me to join his firm, or if not, go into insurance or banking. But none of these ideas appealed to me, I'm afraid. I'd been doing sculpture as a hobby through my teenage years, and although my parents encouraged me in that, it didn't seem like a prospective career at the time, at least not to my father.
But he got a sculptor to look at your work at one point, didn't he?
Oddly enough, yes. We went to see a man who taught sculpture in a big London art school, who said, well, let's have a look at the work. And this chap looked at it and said to my father, your son'll never be any good, you know. And my father was rather relieved and said to me, you see, you can do it as a hobby. And then, when we got home, he said, well, what do you want to do? And I didn't know. Engineering, architecture. I considered various things, even geology. But finally, in the end, after I'd got a maths degree, I said, what I really want to do is sculpture, you know. And he said, well, you'd better do it then.
So he gave in the end.
He did. But I'm glad it happened that way, that I had to struggle to do it, because he made me dedicate myself to sculpture and do the job properly. He had the idea that art was for amateurs, and that was the one thing that I did not want to be. I wanted to do it as a professional. I knew he was wrong, so I set out to prove it. And you know, I'm sure that if I had joined his firm, I'd have done it in a half-hearted way, which he wouldn't have approved of anyway. And I must say, after I decided to become a sculptor, he couldn't have been more supportive.
And so you went on to art college. Did you enjoy it?
At the beginning, I appreciated it a lot because we had a different teacher every term. This meant you got a good grounding in the basics because you picked up different things from each one. You know, it might be the material they worked in, for example, or their technique or whatever. But eventually I got fairly restless because it was a 5-year course, and by about halfway through I was getting a bit fed up because it was extremely traditional in terms of approach, and I was looking for something more out of the ordinary.
So this was what led you to Harold Morton?
Yes. He was the most advanced sculptor of the time. He was really doing very different things, which I found exciting. And so I sent him some photos of my work, and on the off chance, and amazingly, he offered me a part-time job. And so I managed to combine that with the final years of college, which made all the difference.
And how would you sum up that experience? What did you get out of it?
Well, we talked about art a lot. He taught me that a sculptor's studio is quite different from art college.
Mm-hmm.
I had to do drawing at college, a subject I never really understood, and when I got back he would criticise what I'd done. And from him I learned how a sculptor draws, because I was being taught by painters who were looking at things in a different way.
And I suppose it was thanks to him that you started doing abstract art.
Well, yes, it was, because I don't do sculptures of people or animals. They're not meant to be lifelike. So they are examples of what I suppose you'd call abstract art. They're meant to mean something, to make you think.
But you give them titles, don't you? Why?
Well, the titles get attached to them later.
That's the end of part 3. Now look at the fourth and last part of the test. You'll hear 5 short extracts in which different people are talking about living in a village. Each extract has 2 questions. For questions 25 to 34, choose the correct answer, A, B or C. Speaker 1.
The town's noisy and filthy, and I couldn't live there, though the entertainment's good, whereas it's pretty quiet here. But it's a major expedition to get into town to meet my friends. The local council have upgraded our service so there's a regular bus, which sounds good, doesn't it? Yes, well, it is regular, once a day instead of once a week. And midday's no good for the disco, is it? And it's a huge double-decker with 3 or 4 on board if you're lucky. No, we need something different, something much smaller, which could also be booked for special journeys if people wanted, perhaps owned and run by the community itself.
Speaker 2.
There used to be quite a lot going on. Agriculture and small firms, traditional country crafts mainly. Now the farms are suffering and laying off workers, and city people are buying up cottages, so rising house prices are hitting the little enterprises. And people are giving up and drifting away. These are hard times, but I'm not sure we're doing enough. We should be taking the future into our own hands, finding finance for things we want by taking advantage of any government schemes, like this public-private partnership idea, for instance, to set up new ventures or expand existing concerns so the young can stay in the countryside. After all, technology is on our side now, isn't it?
Speaker 3.
I'm thinking of moving into the town. It's manageable here with a car, but running one now is so dear and I'm not getting any younger. What will I do when I'm reduced to public transport? That'll be fun, won't it? My granddaughter says shop on the internet, if I can learn how to use a computer at my age. I don't think it's fair that we should pay the same for petrol as they do in town, where they've got buses and underground. We need a more flexible system, special rates for the countryside. Then we can afford to keep our cars and help our neighbours who haven't got their own transport.
Speaker 4.
I like living here. I work from home. Computer technology and email have changed life completely. No commuting, no waiting at drafty bus stops anymore. But what can you do in your spare time? Chat to friends in the pub? You can walk or cycle for exercise, but that's not very social, is it? I'd like something for team games. Nothing much. A pitch with a clubhouse. There's some land we could use, but it'll need effort and some cash. The local council might help with a grant or a loan, and we could supply the labour. It would bring the youth together, give them somewhere to go.
Speaker 5.
My husband works in the town and we can't afford 2 cars, so I'm stuck here all day. There's still a primary school for the kids, but the grocer's gone and the post office is threatened with closure, and then what'll I do? I think it's partly our own fault. We all go to the town when we can, and so we're not making use of what's here in the village. Perhaps we should be more conscious of the community. I wouldn't mind helping to get a grocer's off the ground or start a mobile one. It might be fun learning how to do that.
That is the end of part 4. That is the end of the test.